Hello and welcome to Rappler Talk. I'm Camille Elemio, Rappler's reporter for media, disinformation, and democracy. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Julie Posetti, the Global Director of Research at ICFJ, or the International Center for Journalists. Welcome to Rappler Talk, Julie.
Thanks for having me, Camille.
Today, we will be talking with her about the landmark case study that she co authored. It's a first of its kind case study, primarily because I think it's the first time that hundreds of thousands of Twitter and Facebook posts were analyzed to shed light on online violence against women journalists. And of course, for this specific case study, they focused on Rappler CEO Maria Ressa. So, Julie, tell us more. Why did you decide to do this study? And of course, why did you decide to focus on Maria?
So this case study has been produced under the umbrella of a bigger global study that has been commissioned by UNESCO into the problem of online violence around the world. And we're looking at 15 countries in that report, but also two emblematic case studies of individual women journalists. And this is about gendered online violence, so specifically the targeting of women reporters as a way of chilling critical reporting, of silencing women, and of preventing the rest of us from knowing things that are in the public interest. And so the decision to focus on Maria as the first case study really does come from two wells. One is a well of knowledge about Maria's situation. I've been researching about Maria and collaborating with Maria on various projects at the intersection of journalism and technology and research since about 2014. So before what we now know to be this, this storm that she's at the epicenter of in terms of her persecution and prosecution in the Philippines, which of course involves Rappler being similarly tested. Before that occurred, I'd had knowledge acquired and an understanding of the really groundbreaking work that Rappler was doing as a news organization focused on leveraging social media for social good. Of course, now we're in a situation where we're trying to respond in a very fraught way to the weaponization of social media for anti-social bad, if you like. So Maria's case was just certainly known to me, but also she represents what has been described as the most emblematic press freedom case study, if you like, internationally, in terms of the intersection of threats and risks facing journalists around the world. This was something that one of the UN Special Rapporteurs, Agnes Callamard herself, in fact, noted a couple of years ago now. So Maria, really does sit at the intersection of viral disinformation, what we might call networked misogyny, and also press freedom erosion in a country run by a populist strongman leader. Now, this is really the epicenter of risk. So because she is both very high profile, because she is under such extraordinary attack, the legal harassment keeps escalating, and because we can demonstrate through her case study that online violence translates to offline threats and genuine risks of a physical kind, we decided to focus first on Maria.
What's the significance of doing this kind of research? I mean, I think this is the first time that there's an evidence-based study on this kind of magnitude. So what's the significance of this?
Yeah, that's very well put, Camille. It is the first time. And there's been a real hunger for evidence. I mean, we have evidence in terms of the impacts on women as individuals and on the chilling effect it has on their journalism. And that's research that's largely been done based on conversations or deep dive interviews with women journalists and editors and civil society organizations. It has never been attempted before to harness that kind of research, which allows us to reflect the lived experience of people being targeted, and combine it with big data analysis, which two fabulous women computer scientists from the University of Sheffield assisted us with, and they led on the big data analysis with the help of two of your colleagues who were devoted to scraping and collecting some of the Facebook data that Rappler hosts in its Shark Tank, as you call your big data base. So this is the first time that we've been able to actually, as you say, provide evidence to demonstrate the scale, the ferocity, as well as the velocity, and the intensity, but also the trajectory of online attacks being fueled by political leaders, being fanned by troll armies, and the ways in which this creates an enabling environment for the prosecution and persecution of a journalist whose life is now at risk and who faces up to a century in jail.
So, Julie, may we ask you to present the key findings of your
Sure.
collaborative study?
Yes, indeed, you may. And I'm just going to try and present my screen. Just bear with me, everybody. Every time we go to share our screens, something new.
For the benefit of our viewers, let me just give you a brief background on what Julie said a while ago about Shark Tank. It's a database of Rappler, but it's mostly like public posts on Twitter and Facebook. So it's not something like the private posts or anything. It's mostly what you post on public groups and pages, as well as your public posts on your profile.
That's right. So can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, yes, as Camille says, the data that we gathered was in fact taken from the Shark Tank that I mentioned. We looked at approximately 399,000 from memory Facebook posts, which were a combination of public posts, so people commenting on public pages, for example, or people's profiles that were in fact public, and others who've commented in a public way on profiles. But also, importantly, and with Maria's express permission, her Facebook page, which she initiated after advice from Facebook in 2015. And so this page, which is a public page as distinct from Maria's private Facebook profile, was also the subject of analysis. So nearly 400,000 of those posts and comments on Facebook. That was 59,000 posts from that set. And on Twitter, we took close to 400,000 tweets, which are, of course, public. So together we have a data set of about, somewhere approaching 500,000 public social media posts across Facebook and Twitter. And so let me take you through now the findings from our case study, which, as I mentioned before, was co-authored with two computer scientists from the University of Sheffield's Centre for Freedom of the Media, Diana Maynard and Kalina Boncheva, and Rappler's own Don Kevin Hapal and Dylan Salcedo. And I'm so sorry, guys, if I'm mispronouncing your names, because I only know you as Kevin and Dylan at this point. So here is the top set of findings, and also I'll talk you through some of our recommendations as well. So we called this case study Maria Ressa in honor of the subject, but fighting an onslaught of online violence. And it's important to note that this is not just a case study that demonstrates the impacts. It's a case study that demonstrates the sort of fierce, independent response of Maria Ressa and Rappler to these attacks. So fighting back is a key theme. Let me just minimize my screen here. So I think this is the most important place to start. This is a global phenomenon, online violence against women journalists. Although Maria is an emblematic case study, the impacts are international. And I think this quote from Maria sort of sums up the importance of this case and the experience of Maria and Rappler in the Philippines on an international level. And that's because this is a global phenomenon, and we have these impacts eroding democracies, spilling into offline threat environments. If you take, for example, even the most recent instance where this has occurred, that would be the Capitol attack in the US, which was not specifically against journalists, but against the seat of American democracy, and the role of disinformation on a viral scale, along with political instigation, was very important to that series of, online threats and bandwagoning into an offline environment. So let's have a look at the key findings. And this is where I think it gets particularly interesting. We found that of that nearly 500,000 posts across Facebook and Twitter, almost 60% were deliberately designed to undermine her professional credibility and public trust in journalism. So first, she was attacked in this torrent of abuse for being a journalist. And why did they do that? Because undermining trust in her critical reporting and in Rappler's independent journalism is a way to undermine public faith broadly in facts, and also a way to create an environment for the belief in disinformation, in falsehoods, and to enable the sort of large-scale extrajudicial killings, for example, with some sort of manufactured public consent that we've seen in the Philippines. Secondly, these credibility and reputation-based attacks usually intersected with disinformation. And one of the classic examples is that they falsely accused Maria Ressa of being fake news, so conflating her with the term fake news, and variations on that, calling her the queen of fake news. Liar was in fact the most common word used to describe Maria, or used against her, along with the really heinous term prostitute, which is to suggest all manner of corruption, which is extremely gendered, and of course is a portmanteau of the words press and prostitute. So it's a very nasty, venal way of attacking a woman journalist. And I should say, what I haven't outlined actually before I go into the other findings is the method that we used to do this analysis. It's called natural language processing. It's a combination of linguistics and artificial intelligence-based analysis, and we also deployed network analysis. So we examined the words, the patterns of their usage, and also the networks of people or bots sharing these forms of abuse across the web, across the social web. So over that point 3 here, over 40% of the attacks in the combined data sets targeted Maria Ressa at a personal level. And again, this was, the abuse was extreme, and often at a visceral level. In fact, 14% of all of the abuse that we identified in the data set was a personal attack that could be described as sexist or misogynistic, and it was often extremely explicit as well. We also saw at point 5 there, one of the real problems that exists for both platforms and also researchers trying to analyze these problems, that a lot of abuse is embedded in memes or in manipulated images connected to posts. And these frequently are undetectable because the tools used to scan for language do not pick up the words contained in a picture, for example. At 6, we had evidence in the mix, and this was aided by the work that Graphica, the digital analytics company that we worked with as well on this project. So their work was focused on the network analysis, and they identified evidence of coordinated and orchestrated attacks on Maria. And we know that this kind of orchestration and coordination is a hallmark of state-led disinformation campaigns, either domestic or foreign actors leveraging these tools for that purpose. Sorry, let me just go to the next findings. So much of the abuse that Maria experienced also saw Ressa and Rappler framed as a criminal, and this was led by President Duterte himself, and also his support groups online, better described, I think, at times as a mob, bloggers and social media influencers who describe themselves openly as pro-Duterte and behave like Duterte's troll army. So the idea of seeding these narratives that demonize both Maria Ressa and Rappler as criminals is very important to understand, because, of course, we are now in a situation where Maria is facing over or up 9, at least, I think, at the current count, cases and charges that she's fighting. She's been back in court, of course, today. And this is, I think, the 3rd appearance in recent weeks. So these narratives, fanned and fueled online, become very important to enable the prosecution and legal harassment and conviction of Maria Ressa, but also Rappler. And of course, Rappler colleagues like Rambo Taliban have been caught up in this as well. Point 8 there, what are the triggers and lightning rods, if you like, for attacks on Maria? Well, unsurprisingly, given what I've just said, they are mostly connected to her investigative reporting and her critique and commentary on Duterte and his leadership, and also on state-linked disinformation. Whenever she appears in high-profile interviews internationally, we can also see spikes in attacks. When she receives industry accolades, and she's probably the most awarded journalist on the planet over the past couple of years, and also when she appears in court. So these are all moments in time that we can track through an analysis of all of these social media posts that we've looked at as points in time where we get a peak of online violence against Maria. Facebook at point 9 here is the main vector, meaning the main vehicle or facilitator of the online violence against Maria. Of course, it's also the most used social media site in the Philippines, and we acknowledge that the Philippines is probably the most prolific user of the internet in the world, at least the Philippines population. So Facebook is, often equated with the internet in the Philippines, and that's partly because of the experimentation with what was known as Facebook Basics, where the internet was bundled, as a sort of free access experience along with Facebook. So it made it very, very widely adopted. Point 10, both Facebook and Twitter have promised to address this problem, specifically as it targets Maria, but in her words, they've failed dismally or woefully, she also told us. Nevertheless, she feels significantly safer on Twitter, and one of the reasons for that is the fact that she has experienced additional protections on that platform compared to Facebook. To put this in perspective, at point 11, what we found was that for every single comment supportive of Maria on her Facebook page, there were approximately 14 comments attacking her. So that's the ratio of attack to compliment, if you like. And finally, at point 12 here, there is direct evidence that the online violence she's experiencing has offline consequences. And we find that she's subjected to very real physical danger, as well as incarceration and conviction on trumped up charges prosecuted by the state, as a result, in part, of this enabling environment that is creating a sort of false consensus for her persecution. And before we move any further, and I'll leave you momentarily with this quote from Maria Ressa's QC, Queen's Counsel, who is the co-lead of her international legal defence team. Let me just describe for you what we plan to do with this information. We plan to advocate, we plan to report, we plan to make a bunch of recommendations at the UN level for action. So Keelan Gallagher points out that there are many baseless lawsuits, and also that this is both instigated at the state level and then fueled by supporters of Duterte. Maria herself, and certainly the researchers on this team, also point to the culpability, if you like, of the platforms, in particular Facebook, because of the extent of the abuse that she has suffered there. So let's have a look at the keywords as we identified them, and apologies in advance for the crassness, if you like, for the offensiveness of the words you see on the screen here. But this is a representation of the most commonly used slurs and insults and terms of attack against Maria. And you can see by the way in which they're represented in this word cloud that the larger the word, the more frequently it was used against Maria. Now, I think it's important to highlight again, Queen of Fake News, variations on the word liar, fake news queen there. Lots of terms using the term liar or synonyms for the word liar, along with many personal insults, were used to attack her. Now, this is based on an analysis of the keywords that we identified on Twitter. So from that sample of nearly 400,000 tweets, these are demeaning words, they're offensive words, they're designed to shut her up. In fact, variations on shut your mouth and shut up are commonplace in the language that we analysed. What I think is really important to point out is that Maria Ressa has done the exact opposite of that. She has refused to shut up, and Rappler has refused to stop reporting. And that is one of the points that we want to illustrate through this case study. So here are a similarly aligned group of common keywords used on Facebook, presented as a bar graph as opposed to a word cloud. But you can see the parallels there. Mostly this was about attacking her professional credibility. And then there were a series of personal attacks, which were either sexist, misogynistic, and explicit. Frequently, they're also, we found, according to the whole data set, racist and in some cases homophobic as well. So the dominant themes, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail now, from that 60% of abuse that was designed to discredit her professionally, we saw the disinformation tactics being deployed. And very important to note, we saw calls from very on for her to be charged and tried, brought to the Senate, for example, was an early hashtag used against her, raped, including one heinous threat that she be repeatedly raped to death. Also, as I said before, the false claim that she is a fake news purveyor herself, which is deeply ironic. So she's being falsely accused of peddling disinformation, which is really like a form of, networked gaslighting, I think. And the term prostitute comes up again and again. So the personal abuse that she suffered included targeting her physical appearance. She has eczema, so frequently she's called words like ugly, and her skin is described in comparison to animals' skin. Lizards, for example, in some of the worst abuse, there were images of her head superimposed on top of a scrotum, and they called her scrotum face. I mean, this is just disgusting. And of course, designed to hurt and designed to dissuade her from putting her head above the parapet. So the personal attacks, as I said, emphasize her skin condition. I've talked about the ways in which she's associated with male genitalia in the abuse. Racist abuse as well, which comments on the color of her skin and depicts her as a monkey, various other forms of animal as well. Homophobic slurs designed to call into question her sexuality, or to expose her to judgment and ridicule from those who might be homophobic, which escalates the risk. And threats of physical violence, including death threats. And I mentioned that really vile threat that she be raped to death. Those sorts of assaults tend to be associated with the worst attacks. So when they're most coordinated, or they're in fact at the highest level in terms of velocity. So the typical methods of attack, we've talked about the fact that they typically appear to be, or rather that the worst of these attacks appear to be orchestrated. And in that context, inauthentic accounts, bot accounts have been detected. In several cases, Facebook has removed networks associated with attacks on Maria, most notably in September last year. And they call this coordinated inauthentic behavior. But despite the fact that there have been on a number of occasions networks removed that have targeted Maria in the context of broader attacks designed to destabilize democracy in the Philippines, she describes Facebook's response to this problem as woefully inadequate. The next point there is that hashtags, which of course, as most netizens in the Philippines know, are used to kind of aggregate conversation and can be used to deploy more organized or coordinated responses, known as sometimes patriotic trolling when it occurs in contexts like this. We see those hashtags being used by the assailants, and Arrest Maria Ressa, as I mentioned, was a very early one, and that was in fact seeded by the Duterte-aligned and eventually Duterte-employed Thinking Pinoy blogger. Means and manipulated images, again, we've talked about that already, and doxing, which is a feature of online violence, which involves, private information such as a physical address or a phone number or an email address, for example, being shared publicly to motivate attackers to target her directly en masse. So let's just, before we go on to look in more detail at some of the triggers, define the term online violence, because it's a term that has some contentiousness attached to it, particularly for people, namely misogynists and those seeking to undermine confidence in public interest journalism, argue is not a real thing because it just happens online. Well, two things about that. We use the words online violence as a term to describe this phenomenon of attack, which comes in the form of abuse and harassment, and is often at the intersection of disinformation, but also includes offline risk associated with the online attacks. And we are seeing per our study with UNESCO and a large global survey, that about 20% of our respondents in that survey, and we surveyed about 1,000 journalists around the world, said they'd been attacked offline in connection with online violence, online attacks. And the fact that this has physical manifestations is an important point to make. The fact that it's bound up with methods of attack that are considered to be cyber violence in the form of doxing, for example, hacking, surveillance, and so on, as it's often the case in the situations facing many of the journalists we've interviewed around the world, but also the acts of constant vile harassment and abuse causes psychological injury. And psychological injury is extremely real. To suggest that it's all in the heads of the women being attacked is highly offensive and insupportable. And so that's why we use the term online violence. It's also a term used by UN Women, other UN agencies, and it reflects years, in fact, decades of progress on in the area of, say, violence against women, domestic violence in the physical realm, where terms such as economic violence and psychological violence and digital violence have been used to describe the combined methods of attack against women, more broadly speaking. So the triggers for the attacks on Maria and Rappler, as I mentioned before, investigative journalism, reporting on the disinformation tactics deployed by the Duterte regime, but also on the acts and policies of this administration as well. Her media appearances, her international awards, and her court appearances. And as Rappler's new executive editor, Glenda Gloria, told us in interview, every single time a complaint reaches court or a statement is made in support of Maria, there's a troll army that she says is commanded to respond. So here's that 2017 Facebook post that I mentioned before, Arrest Maria Ressa, and this was associated with another hashtag, Bring Her to the Senate, which sounds so reminiscent of the kinds of abuse that women in the Middle Ages suffered during the witch burnings, for example. So there's a real gendered element to this. But this is being seeded in 2017 when Thinking Pinoy, the pseudonymous blogger, was traveling with President Duterte in Russia on a state visit. Now, this, of course, can be understood as a thread back to the situation that we now face, where Maria is in court very regularly on multiple charges. I'm just going to end this presentation, though, with a comment from Maria, a quote from Maria, which I think underlines why I have such faith that despite this persecution, despite this prosecution, despite the conviction of this extraordinary journalist and press freedom warrior, Maria Ressa, there is such strength, there is such defiance, there is such determination to speak truth to power, to commit to ethics, and to fight this on a global level. And that comes down to this kind of ethic, which for the global audience, I think is really important to understand, because hopefully, as Maria says, although what has been experienced in the Philippines was a series of early warnings for the West in terms of these threats that you are facing being ported to the West. Hopefully also the strength and resilience that she displays, the determination, can be drawn on by those of us in other parts of the world who are waking up to this crisis only now. So she says, Westerners tend to think strength is like an oak tree. It's big and it's strong and it looks imposing. But I like to think of strength as bamboo, because when there's a really big storm, the oak tree can't bend with the wind, and so it's uprooted and it dies. But bamboo sways and bends with the typhoon, weathering the storm, and in the aftermath, there it remains, standing strong. And that's where I'm going to leave presentation.
Thank you very much, Julie. I personally like that quote from Maria when I was reading your report because it's so Asian. Like,
Yeah,
bamboo has a strong, notable cultural and economic significance
yeah,
in Asia. So, yeah. But
yeah.
just like my key takeaway from your presentation and your study is that the number one goal is really to attack the credibility of Maria. And my question now is, since you've done a lot of stories like this or research like this about other women journalists, is this
Mm.
the pattern that you're seeing, like with other women journalists globally?
Yes, in many cases, yes. I think Maria's case, every kind of threat that we have mapped is in evidence, and I think that's that makes her case relatively unique. It's in evidence in combination with the extreme threat she faces in the context of the decline of democracy in the Philippines and the history of violence against journalists. So it's particularly important that we highlight her case. But it's also very familiar in terms of the analysis that we're doing on Carol Cadwallader's situation, for example. She's a UK journalist, famous for telling the world about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which bound up Facebook, for example, in privacy scandals, but which we understand to have been about, the mass privacy breach with a view to manipulating social media users for political gain. Now, she, of course, put herself in the path of very powerful enemies in doing that reporting, and she's found herself at the center of a Western version of what Maria faces, where although there is, in the UK where she's based, comparative rule of law, she is facing a range of legal complaints. So the law has been weaponized to silence her as well. And the level, although in her case it's mostly Twitter, not Facebook, where the abuse happens, the methods, the tropes are very similar. And this is a pattern we're seeing also in the US, particularly with women journalists who report on politics, who report on technology, who report on disinformation. Same sorts of techniques. And the misogynistic element to this is also really noteworthy as a feature that extends from one side of the planet to the other.
So now, how do we trigger action to protect women journalists like Maria and all the
Yeah.
other, yeah.
This is the million-dollar question, and I won't go through our recommendations now so that we can get to questions, but people can, hopefully you'll put a link to the report in the chat perhaps, and people can look at the recommendations themselves. But to highlight a couple of them, one, global support, online support are really important acts of solidarity. While they might not drown out the attackers, they demonstrate to them that there is a groundswell of support and belief in journalists like Maria and Carol and any number of the other 100 journalists that we interviewed, people like Rana Ayub in India, for example. So I think that is at a practical, personal, individual level. If you are not from a large institution or you don't have significant power, that's something you can do as a citizen, to continue calling out disinformation where you see it, bracing yourself, of course, for the fact that you may well be targeted similarly. So it does take a degree of bravery to put yourself in the line of fire. But it's valuable and it's very much appreciated by the women who are targeted. I think the reality is, in terms of getting the platforms to do enough and to do it at a scale where it makes a significant difference, we are talking about the need for structural and design change at the core of their business models. And we're talking about the need probably for regulation. The risks associated with regulation include the possibility of it being weaponized to suppress freedom of expression and dissent against despots and dictators. So we have to be very careful about balancing the need for regulation to protect the rights of women journalists, for example, to speak and report, against the need to suppress the hate speech that is being deployed against them. But these are things that need to happen. The other thing is that we have to get, where it's possible to dream this up, commitments from politicians, from political parties that require their members and their representatives to abide by a code of conduct that specifically prevents or discourages the targeting and abuse of women journalists online. As you know, these tactics we see frequently being instigated by political actors or fanned and fueled by political actors, and then they tend to skip across into the analog media world, where media on the right, in the Western context, such as the Murdoch press, for example, in the UK and the US, then take up these narratives and create a different kind of pile-on. So these are the sorts of things, ethical professional journalism, appropriate ethics and responsibilities among political actors aligned with some sort of regulatory response, and also individual citizens taking action.
Yeah, you mentioned individual citizens. Aside from calling out disinformation when they spot them, what advice can you give to our viewers and followers on how they can help journalists whenever they get attacked?
I think the best thing that you can do as an individual citizen, connected online, is to not just call out disinformation, but where you have faith and trust in the journalism being produced, to state that, there is a crisis of trust in journalism, but that crisis is not a product of the sort of critical independent journalism that is done by Rappler. It's partly a product of ill behaviour by journalists in certain segments of the industry, and also the demonisation of journalists and journalism by political actors. But and for their political gain. So I think, being prepared to be supportive, and where appropriate, where it's safe for you to do so, calling out those who you think are likely to have an impact in terms of trying to dissuade members of your community from believing in facts, from believing in truth, and just demonstrating human decency, reminders that these are humans, this woman is a person, and you're saying the most vile, venal things. I mean, there is a degree possibly of opportunity for transformation of behavior at the level of an individual who is just swept up, who is not a paid troll. So I think there's still some value in that. I'm not a believer in the in the don't feed the trolls argument, or the don't just block, mute, delete, report. I think those are both tactics that can be useful, but if they can also be used to silence support and to make people feel uncomfortable about speaking up. And I think that's the last thing we need. This is a really existential crisis for democracy.
Going back to the role of platforms, are you confident with the results of this research, as well as those of the other studies conducted in the group of UNESCO research, that you can actually make platforms listen and act on this problem, this long-standing problem?
I remember, Maria says, she once, I think she once had a meal with Mark Zuckerberg, and this was like 2016 or something when this first began, and she tried to draw his attention to this problem. I'd like to have a meal with Mark Zuckerberg and to share with him some of the material that probably won't come out directly in the research, because some of it is so personal and so painful, and some of the journalists who've shared their stories need to protect themselves from that being exposed. But even though I would like that opportunity, I am despondent about the likelihood of change, particularly within that platform, being able to be deployed at a scale that's required. And one of the reasons is I just don't see the leadership at the top on these issues. I can see some shifts at Twitter, for example, and the behaviour of even some of their comparatively junior staff in recognising that this is a problem that is causing such significant damage. And there does appear to be, more of a willingness at the top of that organisation to do something. But neither of these things, without being compelled or required to act, are likely to have the kind of effect internationally that we would like to see. And particularly when you take into account that mostly when they do respond successfully, it's in English. So, be mindful of those women working in, say, the Middle East. There is no kind of real capacity to deal with Arabic or other languages that are more minority languages. And, they tend to prioritize responses in countries like the US and the developed West, which is also extremely problematic.
Yeah, agree. I think just to share with our viewers, one of the key recommendations of your research is for these companies to have like human touch points in every language that they operate in. And I think that's a very good suggestion and recommendation, especially for like us Filipinos. While we speak English, not everyone really, really deal with that or do use that day to day. So yeah, thank you very much, Julie. Any other last thoughts?
Yeah, just that our data was also a combination of English and Tagalog, but the nature of the analysis tools are such that they're not appropriately trained to detect, as we might like, some of the abuse in Tagalog. So that's an inhibition as well.
Julie, you're an award-winning journalist. Any advice for other women journalists out there who are suffering and who are facing this violence almost every day?
Yeah, look, it's really tough. I've been researching this issue really since about 2010. The first interviews I did with journalists talking about being targeted online, and many of them were being cyberstalked by people who represented a real threat to them back then. It's hard, and it's getting harder. The problem is the toxicity at scale, in combination with what I call platform capture, where we as journalists are required, we need to be where our audiences are. We need to be present on social media platforms. So we are sitting ducks, really, for this kind of abuse. The things that we've learned so far, and this kind of advice will come out in the big UNESCO study, but solidarity, sort of social support networks among women journalists are very important. Speaking to people you trust if you are not feeling confident to speak publicly about what you're experiencing, including seeking psychological support, finding people in your organization, if you work for a news organization, where you can share your experiences, and trying to instigate the sort of change that's required inside many news organizations that still really struggle to even accept this as a reality, to ensure that you get appropriate care. So that could include permission to come offline for periods of time. It could include permission to have time off work to recover from, a really serious attack. It could include expectation of digital security and safety, and psychological support in combination, along with training to deal with these issues. Reporting to the platforms and continuing to report on the platforms in this regard, I think, is also very important.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was Dr. Julie Posetti, Global Director of Research at the International Center for Journalists. So what they did was a groundbreaking study. While Maria Ressa was the focus of it, the results show what hundreds of women journalists globally face every day. So what we've learned, government, platforms, these tech companies, and even news organizations, and also civil society have to act to address this problem. I'm Camila Lamia. Join us again next time.